other parts of the Bible, particularly the Rockmart, Ecclesiastes takes a lot more homework. You got to dig into it. But it's a worthwhile reading. It's an now. So that we can read it coming up, in the future. You'll handle it with that. So the start of the prayer will complete it. Thank you, Lord, for this day. Time together already today. We're grateful for the work. Long life and take work. And for your good work, it's totally us. Making it work better. It's praying that you have this kind of life for that. Please be learn more about what the act is about. We'll be able to understand it better if you read it, understanding it, more faithfully, and we dedicate this time to you, because it's meaningful and makes a difference beyond all of them. And pray all day. All right, yeah, you can see on.
The book of Ecclesiastes. It's part of the Bible's wisdom literature, and it opens with this line: the words of Kohelet, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now, in Hebrew, the word Kohelet means someone who has gathered people together. And in this case, it's to learn, so it's often translated in English as teacher. And the teacher is said to be a son or a descendant of King David. And so there are different views about who this figure might have been. Many think that it refers to King Solomon, others to maybe one of the later kings of David's line, and still others think that it's actually a later Israelite teacher who has adopted a Solomon-like persona as a teaching aid. Whichever of these views is correct, the key thing is to recognize that the teacher is a character in the book and is different than the author of the book, who remains anonymous. So we do hear the teacher's voice for most of the book, but it's actually a different voice, the author, who introduces us to the teacher in the first sentence and then at the end concludes the book by summarizing and evaluating everything the teacher just said. So the author is someone who wants us to hear all that the teacher has to say and then help us process it and form our own conclusion. So what does the teacher have to say? Well, the author summarizes the teacher's basic message at the beginning and right at the end. And it's Hevel, Hevel. Everything is utterly Hevel. Now, most English Bibles translate this word Hevel as meaningless, but that doesn't quite capture the heart of the idea. In Hebrew, Hevel literally means vapor or smoke, and the teacher uses this word 38 times in the book as a metaphor to describe how life is, first of all, temporary or fleeting, like a wisp of smoke. But secondly, also how life is an enigma or a paradox. Like smoke, it appears solid, but when you try and grab onto it, there's nothing there. So there's so much beauty or goodness in the world, but just when you're enjoying it, tragedy strikes and it all seems to blow away. Or we all have a strong sense of justice, but all the time bad things happen to good people. So life is constantly, it's unpredictable, it's unstable, or in the teacher's words, like chasing after the wind. Hevel. Now that's kind of a downer. So why is he saying all of this? The author's basic goal is to target all of the ways that we try to build meaning and purpose in our lives apart from God. And he lets the teacher deconstruct these. So the author thinks we spend most of our time investing energy and emotion in things that ultimately have no lasting meaning or significance. And he lets the teacher give us a hard lesson in reality. You can see this most clearly in the opening and closing poems, which focus first of all on time and then on death. So the teacher says, you can spend your whole life working and achieving because you think that makes your life meaningful. You should really stop and consider the march of time. For all of the human effort that takes place in the world, nothing really ever changes. So sure, we develop technology and we build nations that rise and fall, but go climb a mountain and see if it cares. It was there long before any of us, and it will be here long after. I mean, no one's even going to remember you or anything you did 100 years from now, but that mountain It'll still be there. And the ocean will still be breaking on the beach, and the sun will still rise and set. And so time will eventually erase you and me and everything that we care about. And if that's not disheartening enough, the teacher also can't stop talking about death all the way through the book, but especially in this poem near the end. He says, death is the great equalizer, and it renders meaningless most of our daily activities. It devours the wise and the fool, the rich and the poor, no matter who you are, what you've done, good or bad, we're all going to die, and it's inescapable. So with these two ideas in hand, the teacher goes on to consider all the activities and false hopes that we invest our lives in to find meaning and significance, like wealth or career or social status or pleasure. So you think working hard is going to make life worth it? Think about the stress and the toll that that takes on you, all the anxiety and the sleepless nights. And by the time you actually earn some wealth, you're going to be too old to enjoy it anyway. And then by the time that you have to pass it on to someone, they may not even be someone who cares about anything that you did. Or maybe you think pleasure is going to make life worth it for you. Go for it. Live for your vacations, live for the weekend party. Monday always comes. Hevel, hevel. Everything is utterly hevel. So what does the teacher advocate, then? That we become pure hedonists or relativists? Well, no, that would be hevel, too. The teacher acknowledges the ideas from Proverbs that living by wisdom and the fear of the Lord, that these have real advantages. On the whole, life will probably go better for you. See, but the problem is that even living by wisdom and the fear of the Lord, they're hevel, too, because they don't guarantee a good life. Good people die tragically, and horrible people live long and prosper. There's just too many exceptions. And so even wisdom is a hevel. Again, not meaningless, but an enigma. Wisdom doesn't work the way you think it should all of the time. So what's the way forward in the midst of all this hevel? And here, paradoxically, the teacher discovers the key to the true enjoyment of life under the sun. It's accepting hevel. It's acknowledging that everything in your life is totally out of your control. About 6 different times at some of the bleakest moments in his monologue, the teacher talks about the gift of God, which is the enjoyment of simple, good things in life, like friendship or family, a good meal, or a sunny day. You can't control these things. You're certainly not guaranteed them, but that's their beauty. When I come to adopt a posture of total trust in God, it frees me to simply enjoy my life as I actually experience it, not as I think it ought to be. Because even my expectations about what life ought to be are ultimately hevel. Hevel. Everything under the sun is utterly hevel. And so the teacher's words come to a close. Right here at the end, the author speaks up again, and he brings it all to a conclusion. He says, the teacher's words are very important for us to hear. He likens them to a shepherd's staff with a goad, a pointy end, which might hurt when it pokes you, but he says the teacher is trying to poke you to get you to move in the right direction towards greater wisdom. The author then warns us that you can actually take the teacher's words too far, and you could spend your whole life buried in books trying to answer life's existential puzzles. Don't try, he says. You'll never get there. And so instead, the author offers his own conclusion, and it's this. Fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of humans, for God will bring every deed into judgment, every hidden thing, whether good or evil. And so the author thinks it's good to let the teacher challenge your false hopes and remind you that time and death make most of life completely out of your control. But what gives life true meaning is the hope of God's judgment. The hope that one day God will clear away all of the hevel and bring true justice to our world. And it's that hope that should fuel a life of honesty and integrity before God, despite the fact that I remain puzzled by most of life's mysteries. And that's the wisdom of the book of Ecclesiastes.
Ecclesiastes is dense, but it's rewardingly so. And we're going to look now at the wisdom that Ecclesiastes offers and how to read Ecclesiastes for our own personal spiritual benefit. Last time that we were together, a couple weeks ago, we were into Proverbs. So we're in this stretch of scripture that's typically called the wisdom literature. Began with Job, continued with Psalms, went to Proverbs after that. Today's Ecclesiastes, and there's one more book in this section, which next time we will get to Song of Solomon. All right, let's talk about the title. Our traditional English title is Ecclesiastes. We get that from the book's heading in the Latin translation, the Latin Vulgate translation, Vulgate meaning common. The Latin Vulgate was the accepted, widely used Bible of Christians for, 1,000 years, give or take. Liber Ecclesiastes means Book of Ecclesiastes. The Latin title comes from the Greek term, Ecclesiastes, for the speaker's designation in Ecclesiastes 1:1. And then that in turn, so you've got the Latin translated from the Greek translated from the Latin taken from the Greek translated from the Hebrew, and the Hebrew term is Koheleth. It's related to the term assembly, kahal. So, therefore, Bible interpreters have guessed with a fair amount of agreement that this term is a title for someone who addresses an assembly, and it's why if you open your Bible to Ecclesiastes 1:1, you'll probably see him referred to as the preacher, the words of the preacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Could also refer to someone who possesses some other leadership role in an assembly. There's been debate about whether Kohelet is a personal name or title. The title seems more likely. Anyway, that's some background on the title of Ecclesiastes. What can we say about the authorship? Strictly speaking, Ecclesiastes is anonymous. There's no personal name attached to it. Traditionally, Jewish and Christian scholars have ascribed authorship to Solomon. For the following reasons, the book describes the preacher, the one addressing the assembly, as the son of David, king in Jerusalem. That fits Solomon, his profile. He's described as someone who is surpassingly wise. Ecclesiastes 1:16 says, I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. He had a prosperous reign. We know that about him as well. It's also difficult to find a later king in Jerusalem who's a better candidate than Solomon for claiming that he had acquired wisdom, surpassing wisdom. Difficult to find a better candidate who had great possessions, as he puts it, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. That's some of the evidence from within Ecclesiastes that Solomon was the author. You heard from the video, though, there's a couple of other thoughts out there, but it's hard to argue against this. The date, if Solomon's the author, then we can date the book of Ecclesiastes probably toward the end of Solomon's reign, give or take. So his reign was 970 to 930 BC. So you could say 935 BC for the writing of Ecclesiastes. Why the end of his reign and not toward the beginning? It's because Solomon's reign is largely described as a peaceful, prosperous time. But toward the end of his reign, especially by that point, he has married, taken many other wives, hundreds of wives. He's got concubines. He has been led into the worship of additional gods. And so by the end of his reign, he's in a different kind of spiritual state than at the first, and his kingdom has also suffered the effects of that fading leadership. So his kingdom at the end could be described in terms of hedonism, materialism, and frustration, and that lends itself more to the writing of Ecclesiastes, in which he's looking out over the condition of life and he's been writing about it. Again, we're just kind of making educated guesses here. Anybody have a question so far about title, authorship, date? Yeah, that's a good thought there. Especially with the tone of Ecclesiastes, it's kind of dreary at times. It's just very honest and dreary, and that could describe Solomon toward the end of his reign, perhaps. Yeah. 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 And so that would certainly lead him down a road of thinking that we find in Ecclesiastes about the vanity of things and the yet fleetingness. And it's a good thought, good point. Well, let's move on. What's the purpose of Ecclesiastes, or what was the occasion for this book? Like the rest of the Bible's wisdom literature, Ecclesiastes is concerned with imparting wisdom and knowledge to the people of God. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 9 through 11 says, "Besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. The preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth." He was hoping to teach them to fear the Lord also. The speaker's designation indicates he was addressing an assembly, although chapter 5, 1 through 7 suggests setting outside the temple. And then there's some hints that he is speaking to a diverse audience. On the one hand, in chapter 8, he's addressing royal counselors, but then in chapter 11, seems to be addressing common farmers. Chapter 11, verse 6, "In the morning sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that." Sounds like he's speaking to a farmer. So that's what we can say about the purpose or the occasion for Ecclesiastes, imparting wisdom to a diverse group of people. Yep. Literary features. Ecclesiastes is pretty interesting from a literary standpoint. It is wisdom literature, but you can't think about it like the book of Proverbs. There are proverbs in Ecclesiastes, but they're presented and arranged differently. They're not in these little couplets like you see throughout Proverbs. They're arranged more into what they call here clusters, even paragraph forms. But there is a unifying plot line that organizes all of it together. And basically the unifying plot line is, as I said, vanity, vanity, vapor, vapor. Depending on which part of Ecclesiastes you're reading, it would either classify as a recollection, a reflection, or a mood piece. I'm not so studied enough to delve into the distinctions between these. It sounds like there's some overlap, but I'm sure there's some distinctiveness. And all these are expressed by a narrator who's telling the story of his quest to find satisfaction in life. You do get the sense of through Ecclesiastes, you're on a kind of a journey. This quest, it's reconstructed from the vantage point of someone whose quest ends satisfactorily. For all of the slog and all the density of Ecclesiastes, it gives me the sense of stepping into a clearing when you get to chapter 12 and they sum up the book. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near, of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. The end of the matter has been heard. Fear God, keep his commandments. That's the satisfying end to Ecclesiastes. There's transitions all throughout that help us to keep a sense of progress here. He says at various times, so I turned to consider, or again I saw, or then I saw. You get a sense as you continue reading, there's a discrepancy between the narrator's present outlook and his futile search from the past. He's speaking from a standpoint of wisdom now. Speaker recalls the labyrinth of dead ends that he pursued. He recreates his restless past with vividness, but that is not his present or mature outlook. It's like you and I, from where we stand right now with the accumulated wisdom of our lives, and we're looking back on earlier times, previous times in our lives, and we're being honest in saying that at those times we were searching, we were not as mature at that time, we were a different kind of person. That's kind of the effect you get from reading Ecclesiastes. So along with the narrative thread, the book demonstrates what you call an observational format. He offers several observations. Gives the book a meditative cast. In other words, it feels very much like a reflection. He's meditating, he's reflecting that sense of it. There's several recurring words and motifs that also hold it all together. Under the sun. Nothing new under the sun, or something like that occurs more than 30 times. So that rate of recurrence is a strong signal that phrase, under the sun, is a major theme of the book. And again, hevel, vanity, appears throughout the book. And it suggests the fleetingness of our grasp of the full meaning of events. I find this relatable when I think about, the scope of the world that we live in and how complex our world is. And as I get older, it just feels more and more complicated, and it's just kind of a swirl of activity in life, and from that standpoint, I relate somewhat better to Ecclesiastes and how he's trying to make sense of the world and how it feels kind of chaotic. The author helps to keep us rooted in the real world with references to eating, drinking, toil, sleep, death, cycles of nature. The basic building block of the book is the proverb. A proverb being a short, pithy saying that communicates a moral lesson, a spiritual truth. So it's similar to the book of Proverbs in that respect, but the way these proverbs are arranged is different from the book of Proverbs. Book of Ecclesiastes, it says it flaunts its poetic medium more than ordinary wisdom literature. In other words, it's just highly poetic. And you and I, all of us, not being, Hebrew scholars, it's hard with our English translations to really appreciate how poetic this book is, but the folks who are experts in Hebrew will certainly emphasize that. As Hebrew poetry goes, it's a heavily poetic book. There was a lot of care put into it, to crafting this book and writing it. The author demonstrates mastery of image, metaphor, simile. We talked about these with, I think, the book of Psalms. The book is partly observational, also descriptive in its format. It makes several observations about real life. There's a lot of points at which in Ecclesiastes, talking about eating drinking, sleeping, getting up and working. We can relate to that. Those are observations from life. And it's the proper way to read this is a meditative way. In other words, to read it and use it as a reflection point of our own life. Meditating as in reflecting. Reflect on the experience of the phenomena that the author describes. The book is also very affective. It inspires various moods. It's a moody book. Any question about the literary features of Ecclesiastes? If you haven't read it before, if it's been a long time since you've read it, I'd encourage you to read it through, not strictly to understand all of it, to get just a feel for it. There's a special feel to the book of Ecclesiastes. So in addition to literary features, what about themes? The necessity of fearing God in a fallen, frequently confusing and frustrating world. Ecclesiastes conveys the tragic reality of the fall. In other words, it reflects the fact that we live in a fallen, broken, spiritually bent world. We get this sense, these are references to Paul's words in Romans 8, talking about creation groaning. You get a sense of that as you're reading Ecclesiastes. Another major theme, Ecclesiastes conveys the vanity of life. It goes back to that Hebrew word, hevel. Vanity, vanity. The book begins and ends with the exclamation. Literally, it means vapor, conjures up a picture of something fleeting, ephemeral, elusive. When we apply that to life, it means that the present form of this world is passing away. Expresses frustration, anger, or sorrow. And when it comes to our attempt to understand life, this phrase, vanity, hevel, it indicates that there are some things that remain incomprehensible or inscrutable. Another major theme is that Ecclesiastes reflects on sin and death. I'll read that reference to Ecclesiastes 1:14 and 15 when it talks about the incomprehensibility, inscrutability of some parts of life. He says, I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight. What is lacking cannot be counted. Expressing confusion there. Ecclesiastes reflects on sin and death. The preacher is only too aware of the reality, this reality that affects everyone. In that famous passage in Ecclesiastes 3, he leads off by saying there's a time to be born and a time to die. And then chapter 6, verse 6, he says, even though he should live 1,000 years twice over, yet enjoy no good, do not all people go to the one place? It's a reference to death. Ecclesiastes conveys the joy and the frustration of work. This echoes, the beginning of the world, what life was like before the fall in Eden, joy of work, and then frustration of work that comes as part of the curse. So the preacher writing here in Ecclesiastes says that on the one hand, he finds his work satisfying. Chapter 2, verse 10, he says, my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. But he also says he finds work aggravating. Just a few verses later, he says, I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. So he touches on the joy and the frustration of work. Ecclesiastes conveys the grateful enjoyment of God's good gifts. For all the time that he is, lamenting the difficulties of life in this world, he still remarks on the beauty of this world. Ecclesiastes 3:11. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Chapter 2, 24 through 26. Says there's nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? So these are to be received and enjoyed as blessings from God. Ecclesiastes also conveys the fear of God. Ecclesiastes 3:14. God has done it so that people fear before him. Ecclesiastes is a summons for us to fear. And by that we mean reverentially fear. We stand in awe of God. Any question or comment about the themes of Ecclesiastes? Vanity, the fear of the Lord, enjoyment of life, frustration of life, sin and death. Yeah, thank you, Bill. Yeah, that's a helpful way to put that. Yeah. Hopefully we've all found enjoyment in work, but no doubt there is a percentage of our work that is frustrating, and that makes Ecclesiastes relatable to us. So as far as Ecclesiastes and its place in salvation history, the great story of redemption that God is unfolding in our world and in the pages of Scripture, we could say these things. To begin, it's impossible for any human being to fully grasp how his or her decisions will contribute to God's grand scheme. You and I we don't know. We can't think that far ahead or that deeply or extensively. We make the best decisions we can, but at the same time, we don't fully know the repercussions, the implications. Ecclesiastes teaches that we don't have to fully grasp this. By fearing God and keeping his commandments, chapter 12, we believers participate in God's plan in ways that we cannot, as it says, find out. So we are mainly largely trusting that God will take care of the big plan. What you get from reading Ecclesiastes is this author makes many sharp observations, but at the same time, he does not have it all figured out. But in place of having it all figured out, he is willing and glad to trust God. And at that point, I would say that bears a close kinship with the book of Job. Job spent so many chapters and so much ink, lamenting his condition and trying to make sense of why he was experiencing such pain and hardship. But ultimately, Job's final position on this is that he's just determined to trust God. And there's something similar there that Ecclesiastes teaches. We can also draw some analogies between the preacher figure here in Ecclesiastes and Jesus. How so? Jesus, like the preacher, is a son of David. He's king. He is and possesses wisdom from God. He is one shepherd. And in Jesus' ministry, something greater than Solomon has arrived. that leads us to this outline of Ecclesiastes. So here's one helpful way to understand the outline of the book. And if you're going to read through Ecclesiastes, you can look over this beforehand or have it with you as you read through, and it kind of helps you to keep your bearings in the book, so to speak. You've got the introduction and the theme in chapter 1, verse 1. The words of the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? Then you've got a first catalog, first grouping of vanities, or these fleeting phenomena. And that's chapter 1, verse 4 through chapter 2. Vanities of the natural world, vanities of wisdom and knowledge, pleasures, possessions, accomplishments. And then that brings you to chapter 3, and that's probably for us the most memorable part of Ecclesiastes. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. And then following that, he is talking about fearing God. And then comes a second catalog or grouping of vanities, fleeting phenomena of life, having to do with mortality, and then labor or work, and then wisdom itself. And then again, the refrain at the beginning of chapter 5, fear God, the holy and righteous one. It says, guard your steps when you go to the house of God. To draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools. Do not be rash with your mouth. Do not let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God, for God is in heaven and you are on earth. Therefore, let your words be few. In chapter 5, verse 8 and following, he talks about life under the sun, which is to say he's making observations about life as it regularly happens with the rising and the sun, the cycle of days. He observes instances of injustice, greed versus contentment. In chapter 7, 25 through 29, he gets to the heart of the problem, sin. I turned my heart to know and to search out and to seek wisdom in the scheme of things and to know the wickedness of folly and the foolishness that is madness. And then he goes back to talk about more observations of life under the sun. Talks about foolish authorities. Talks about the limits of human knowledge. He says that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. On a personal note, you know, how it makes me think about my life, I love reading and learning. You know, I've been, I think of myself as a lifelong student, and so I like to acquire books to help, you know, feed my desire for learning. And as a pastor, you really have to try to have a working knowledge of several different areas. And so, you know, the books that I have in my office, for instance, are divided into different areas that I feel responsible for as a pastor. And I love reading. I try to keep up a regular schedule. But gosh, the further along I go, the more I realize that I'm never going to grasp it all. And it's very likely that I have books on my shelf that I will never get around to reading. And I feel a kinship with the author of Ecclesiastes on that standpoint. You know. And even then, when I read it, it's, you know, how well I retain it is a whole nother question. But there are limits to human knowledge. It talks about the unpredictability of life, juxtaposed with the certainty of death. This is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that the same event happens to all. Yep. He talks about finding enjoyment as circumstances allow. Chapter 9, 7 through 10. Go and eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. Let your garments always be white. Let not oil be lacking on your head. Those are positive images. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love all the days that He's given you under the sun, because that's your portion in life. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. Talks about the paths of wisdom and foolishness. And then toward the end, talks about aging and the vanity, the fleeting sense of mortal life. Let's see. Remember the Creator in the days of your youth, before the years draw near, of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Before sun and light, moon and stars are darkened. No. And then chapter 8, he brings all things to a head, puts all things in the perspective that you're really aching for by this point in Ecclesiastes 12, 8 through 14. He says, the end of the matter is this: all has been heard. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. How do we make sense of a life full of fleeting experiences? Ultimately, we fear God, we keep His commandments, and we trust that the judge will judge rightly all things. Any question or comment about Ecclesiastes? It's worthwhile reading, I promise. Bill. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Very consistent with the message of Ecclesiastes. Yeah. Thank you for showing us that unity there in Scripture. Any other comments or questions? Yeah. Yeah. How do we cope with it? But it's to fear God and to keep His commandments. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I'm convinced that the other constant in life, frustratingly constant thing in life, is that Auburn's football team will always deal me fits. Yeah. Yeah, I'm pretty convinced of that. I thank y'all so much for participating, and I really do challenge you, encourage you to read through Ecclesiastes and take it as quickly or as slowly as you'd like. And but again, it's a rewarding experience, and with repetition, as with so many things, with repetition comes greater skill and understanding. Next time that we get together, we're going to look at the Song of Solomon. We're going to couple that with, date night or something like that, because it gets really romantic and fun. Anyway, I quoted from Song of Solomon yesterday at Jackson Norris's wedding. There's a couple of lines that I think really go nicely for end of wedding services. And anyway, I'm going to say a prayer for us, and we're going to be dismissed. Lord, your word is good, and it's rich, and it's a well that never runs dry. And the deeper we go, the deeper we want to go. And thank you for Ecclesiastes and its contribution to our spiritual formation. And I pray, Lord, that for all of us, as we take up this particular book and read it, that you will grant us insight and wisdom, Lord. We do find so much relatable in the experiences of toil and enjoyment, a cycle of enjoyment with suffering, the certainty of death, but also the experiences of life before that, Lord. The fact that there is nothing new under the sun. We find our foothold, our stability in all this as we look to you, you who exist above and outside of all of this, even as you have entered into this experience with us. We are determined, Lord, that we will fear you in the sense of reverential fear. We will strive to keep your commandments, and that is how we will make it through all of this cycling and shuffling and this series of vanities upon vanities. Thank you, Lord, for the gift, which is this book of Ecclesiastes. And thank you for blessing our readings of your word in the days ahead. It's in your name that we express our gratitude for this whole day together and for the life change that you are bringing about in our lives and throughout our congregation. We pray all this in your name, Father, Son, and Spirit. And everybody said,